Good afternoon and welcome to the latest news series of We Got Planning News for You as we rapidly approach our fifth year. Can I start by the usual reminder to you to consider making a donation to charity in lieu of a registration fee. There's a whole range of charities that we support, which can be found on our webpage, www.havewegotplanningNewsForYou.com, or the abbreviation of that. We are delighted to start our latest series with the most suitable person you possibly could have to discuss the rebirth of strategic planning introduced by the new government, the Queen of Strategic Planning herself, Catriona Riddell. Catriona, good evening. I think it's your third time on the show. Certainly, I think it is your third, isn't it? So
yeah, it's my third time, and it's great to be able to say something different and not just go on about bringing back strategic planning. It's here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's not quite a year, but it's coming.
Absolutely. And you join a select club. I think it's Joanna Averley and probably nobody else who's been on 3 times. So thank you very much. We're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on, and I say there's no one better placed to tell us all about how it's going to play out than your good self. I'm going to ask you the questions which I've asked you twice before. Where are you calling from? Somewhere different, I think, or your decoration or your pictures. What if anything you're drinking this evening?
I am still in Thames Ditton, and I am drinking a big tumbler disguised as water, but it's not really water.
Very good to hear. I could do with a bucket of gin after the day I've had. I'm on the green.
When the sun shines, water just doesn't do it.
Absolutely. Well, Paul's going to lead the interview with you in the second half of the show. As you know by now, I do obviously welcome any comments you have on the cases, on the news that we have in the meantime, but no obligation. And in the meantime, let's go over, as always, first up to Mary. How are you doing, Mary?
Good evening, Charlie. Hello, everyone. I can't believe it's our 14th season. That's unbelievable. I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. I'm sitting in the offices of Town Legal, and although I have a big bucket, it really is water, I promise you. Weird.
Good stuff, Chris. How are you? You look somewhere different today.
I'm at an inquiry. I've just done 6 hours of cross-examination just on need, and I think everybody else...
Shorter ones.
All on a test to that, and I'm just absolutely exhausted, and I think everybody else has lost the will to live. So,
the poor witness.
Yeah. I feel for the witness, yeah, for sure.
And when are you going to ask your second question? Anyway. Paul, how are you doing, mate?
I'm doing well, Charlie. I've just run across London to be able to log on, and I'm currently in a shared rented office area, so I'm very conscious my voice needs to stay a little bit lower than normal, and I'm sweating profusely because I'm just run from St Pancras to here. So, hello, and I'm drinking water because I need it. Hello, Catriona.
Good to see you, Paul. I will try not to embarrass you in front of the people that you're sitting with. And Sasha, how are you?
I'm very well, Charlie. I'm slightly worried about Paul's health, hearing he's just run somewhere. We must look for early stages of heart failure.
Yes.
I'm in London, very happily in London, and I'm in a very good mood because North London is red, as everyone who
Did you go at the weekend?
I did go. And I had a concert.
You buy your own ticket?
Yeah, I did.
Fancy that.
One of the rare Arsenal fans who doesn't get freebies.
Good. Well, great to see you as always, Sasha. And I'm going to pass straight back to you, actually, because you're going to lead on with the news.
I am. And I've got two items that I particularly wanted to bring to our viewers' attention. The first is the release of the Planning Inspectorate Statistical Analysis. Now, I'm going to get into a bit of trouble for saying this, but I'll have a go. But I do find it a bit peculiar that the statistical results don't tell you the results. They tell you the time, but why not the results? So there's a bit of a audit of how it compares to the past, etc., etc. But there are some very interesting stats that I thought the viewers would be interested. The first is that there are 13,000 open cases sitting in Bristol, i.e. yet not determined but appealed. There are 18,000 appeals determined per year as of last year. In terms of the various elements of the workload, there are 50 live EIP examinations currently taking place, which of course, as we all know, at various stages from birth to death in the 50. And there are also, in terms of decision times, these are quite interesting, 27 weeks median times for written reps, 24 weeks for hearings, and 31 weeks for inquiries. In terms of NSIPs that are going through the system, the Planning Inspectorate is providing advice on 74. 18 have been submitted and at various stages prior to determination. 4 are currently considering their recommendation and 9 sit before the Secretary of State. There are currently 436 inspectors, of which they are dealing with 512 inquiries last year, of which, and this is very interesting because, of course, the vast majority of our caseload, or I'm going to have the pleasure of a hearing next week, the vast majority of what we do are public inquiries, of which, guess, tiny percentage, 2.8% of overall appeals are public inquiries, although by far the most noteworthy and public are the public inquiries, 2.8% of the workload. Hearings, not much higher, 4.1%. So the appeal system in Britain, and certainly in England and Wales, is predominantly a written reps process of 93%, which is interesting. Now, another couple of stats I wanted to raise, not Planning Inspectorate, but the HBF have released a report today about housing approvals. And it is noteworthy that housing approvals in the recent 3 months, are significantly down. 3% less than the previous 3 months, but more importantly, 13% less approvals than the same time last year. So we are currently in a period before the cavalry that might be termed the MPPF changes come forward. We are 13% down on the approvals being granted on last year's figure. So that is the quick run through the stats that I thought would be quite interesting for our viewers. I want to make one last point, which will affect those with a London focus and particularly London planning, and those that particularly live in Merton will be interested in that there is the release of the GLA report number 3 today on the All England's expansion, and that has, interestingly, a recommendation for approval from the planning officers. So anyone who wants to see how the GLA works, and I highly recommend reading the Stage 3 report, which was published hot off the press today, as I understand it. So that is my news update, Charlie.
Thanks very much indeed, Sasha. Very interesting to see that hearing times have come down quite significantly since it used to be about, it wasn't long ago, they were double that, actually.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah. So we should congratulate PINS.
Yes, very much so on that, absolutely. Good. So now, Mary, the first of our case reports on the high-profile decision of the High Court, probably Mr. Justice Holgate's final case before his elevation to the Court of Appeal, quashing the consent for the Whitehaven coal mine in Cumbria. So over to you.
Indeed, Charlie, indeed. And this is another epic from Mr. Justice Holgate. This is a 50-page judgment, which I will attempt to do justice to. And let me just start by reminding you that the public inquiry into the proposals was held in September, October 2021. And that was before the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court's decision in Finch. The decision letter was issued in December 2022, and the challenges, because there were 2 statutory challenges which were joined, as it were, those challenges were launched in January 2023, and by that stage, the Court of Appeal's judgment in Finch had been handed down, and the Supreme Court had given permission to challenge that decision. So the context, I think, is just sort of quite interesting, and the change in context. So there were 2 statutory appeals. One was brought by Friends of the Earth. The other was by Lakeland Action on Climate Change two groups that had appeared at the inquiry. There were four grounds of the challenge. The first ground I'm going to call the Finch ground, and that was, you will recall, in the summer, in July, the Secretary of State, once the Finch Supreme Court decision was out, shortly after, the Secretary of State consented to judgment on the Whitehaven case on the Finch ground. In other words, they accepted that the Secretary of State had erred by deciding that greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of Whitehaven coal were not a significant likely effect of the proposed development. But the mining company, the developer, West Cumbria Mining, continued to resist that ground. And, I mean, perhaps unsurprisingly, you might think, given the Supreme Court decision, that West Cumbria Mining were unsuccessful, and so the decision was quashed on that ground. The other really interesting, the second ground I want to talk to, was on substitution. And let me just explain how that came about. So the developer had argued that there would not be an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, including downstream emissions, because the extraction of Whitehaven coal would result in an equivalent amount of American coal remaining in the ground. So that was the way that the developer put the case. And they said the Whitehaven coal would be at a competitive advantage over US coal for the UK and the European market. And so the Whitehaven coal would be used as a substitute, so the argument went, for US coal. But on the substitution argument, Mr. Justice Holgate was very forthcoming. He said, quotes, "It would be absurd for the assertion of no net increase in greenhouse gas emissions because of substitution to mean that the burning of the Whitehaven coal could not be a significant effect for EIA purposes, and hence removing the need for an assessment of greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of the Whitehaven coal. Instead," he said, "the correct analysis is that both are significant matters, and if the substitution of US coal would be a likely effect of the proposed project, both effects had to be assessed, and of course neither had been assessed." So he made it perfectly clear that the substitution of the US coal was not a relevant factor in determining whether the burning of the Whitehaven coal would be a likely significant effect. And importantly, he said, in the context of the EIA regulations, in the light of Finch, there was an evidential burden on the developer to produce information in its environmental statement to demonstrate this claimed substitution. And he found that they hadn't done that. He also found that neither the inspector nor the Secretary of State had actually made a finding of fact that they accepted or did not accept the substitution argument. And so that ground was successful. The third ground was about the impact of a grant of permission on the ability of the United Kingdom to perform its leadership role in promoting international action to address climate change. And the judge found that that was a substantial matter which ought to have been the subject of a finding by the inspector and the Secretary of State, and that finding needed to be the subject of legally adequate reasoning, and it wasn't. And so they were successful on their third ground. And the fourth ground related to offsetting, where again the Secretary of State had erred in law in the treatment of the issues relating to the proposed scheme for offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. And in particular, the point was taken that any offsetting should have occurred in the UK before one looked abroad. And of course, the argument here was that, was the substitution, the American coal substitution argument. So in a nutshell, and I know I won't have done justice to the submissions of either Paul Brown or Estelle de Haan on behalf of the two successful claimants, but that's it in a nutshell. Thanks very much, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary. Fascinating, really important case, and not least not only on its facts, but Mr. Justice Holgate's application of Finch, because after the Supreme Court gave its divided judgment in Finch, everyone was scratching their heads as to what the implications were. And this is our first steer from the High Court. So definitely one to read if you've got a case that may be affected by Finch. Now, I'm going to deal with the second case, and it's about pylons. But it's not the pylons case, perhaps a precursor. A proposal, a DCO, concerning the reinforcement of the electricity transmission network between the existing Bramford substation in Suffolk and Twinstead in Essex through the construction operation of a 29-kilometre new 400 kilovolt transmission line with about 18 kilometres of overhead line, 50 pylons and 111 kilometres of underground cable and various associated infrastructure. The examining authority at the Planning Inspectorate, who considered the project, consisted of no fewer than 4 examining inspectors, and they recommended that the DCO be granted, and the Secretary of State agreed. Now, the decision is of interest for the following reasons in particular. And firstly, it's clear that the Secretary of State placed great weight on the need case for reinforcing the existing transmission network in the area, having regard to the support for this kind of facility in the National Policy Statement EN1. Secondly, there doesn't appear to have been a particularly high degree of controversy. I say doesn't appear because I wasn't involved, but based upon the decision documents, not a particularly high degree of controversy about the comparatively limited number of pylons proposed. I say comparatively by way of comparison to some other schemes in the pipeline, which concern a significantly larger stretch of overhead line and pylons. And the Secretary gave only little negative weight for landscape and visual impacts, which he didn't consider were particularly great. And the issue of alternatives doesn't seem to have been a principal important controversial issue. In relation to heritage, another point of interest, the Secretary of State noted there'd be a small degree of harm to one scheduled ancient monument, but limited harm to a listed building. And he acknowledged that the 2024 EN1 MPF required, like the MPPF does in conventional planning cases, required the Secretary of State to give considerable importance and weight to the desirability of preserving all heritage assets, consistent with statutory duty in the planning context. But he went on to note that the policy also said that the greater the harm, the greater the justification would be needed for any loss. And here he went on to opine that as the harm was relatively limited, it was consistent with the policy objective of giving great weight to preserving heritage assets, to give only moderate negative weight against making the order in light of the relatively limited impact. And that illustrates that giving great weight to the objective doesn't always mean giving great weight to the harm, however small. There is a nuanced but important difference which sometimes is overlooked. And this case is quite a good illustration of that point. Overall, the Secretary of State considered that the harm was relatively limited and unavoidable for a scheme for which there was a clear nationally significant need and therefore granted consent. Note in particular, unavoidable. And the decision shows that where alternatives have been properly considered and discounted, schemes of national significance for which a need is enshrined in the National Policy Statement are likely to be received favourably in the DCO examination process, probably all the more so where they're energy projects for said to support renewable energy or energy security, particularly in light of the new government. But that's not to say it shouldn't be thought, however, that it follows that where, unlike in this case, it's evidence that the need could be met in some less impactful way. It's not to say that couldn't bring down a DCO. Clearly, where there are less impactful alternatives to meeting a identified need, simply pointing to the need isn't necessarily going to get the developer home. So it all turns upon context. So that's pylons, and from coal mines to pylons to housing. And Chris, you're going to take us to High Wycombe and a Taylor Wimpey scheme that is the subject of an appeal.
I am, and guess what? It's another allocated site. So this is the subject of an appeal. That seems to be a rich diet for pretty much all of us all of the time. A very sorry state of affairs, really. So this is a big application, land at Gone Valley in High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. And it was a hybrid application in the sense that there was a full application for 79 dwellings, and the vehicular access and some landscaping, and then an outline scheme for the vast majority of the proposal, 461 dwellings, a one-form entry primary school, 1.4 hectares of employment land, community space, etc., etc. So Taylor would be obviously very keen to get on and to put in a detailed scheme for the first phase, and then the rest obviously is outline. Now, the appeal was dismissed, and obviously that's an enormous disappointment on an allocated site. But I think it'd be fair to say that the council went about seeking to refuse in a fairly comprehensive way. They refused the application on 17 putative reasons for refusal, and the appellants successfully overcame 16 of those. But as we all know, if you're for the appellant, you've got to win on everything. And unfortunately, they were unsuccessful on highways. It was an EIA development, as you might imagine. There was an amendment to description, and there was, all the inevitable complications that you get with a scheme of this size. It was an allocation in the Wycombe District Local Plan adopted in 2019. It occupies an appeal site, a residential-led mixed-use allocation, HW6 in the local plan, allocated for a whole variety of benefits, which, of course, the scheme was seeking to deliver. There was a development brief, which had actually been adopted prior to the adoption of the local plan, but obviously had been part and parcel of that process. So obviously the developer was seeking to adhere to the development brief, but was unsuccessful. Why were they unsuccessful? Well, it was only on one issue, and that is traffic. And if there's one issue that really can be very difficult to overcome, it is traffic. There was a big issue about the traffic modelling. The developers used Linsig. The inspector does pass comments on whether it would have been better to use a micro-simulation model. Me and Paul know all about that, and whether with a series of junctions affected on the A40, a micro-simulation model would have been more appropriate. The conclusion as far as all the highways was concerned was that the inspector grappled with paragraph 115 of the framework. He said, as we all know, there's no definition of severe in the framework, and although accepting it's a high bar, it is one in which you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis and just make that judgment. Various appeal decisions were provided, no doubt, the Longbridge roundabout and so on up in Preston. But the inspector just came to the conclusion that the impact was severe. He thought the corridor is forecast to be overloaded and the modelling undertaken is insufficiently robust to convince me that the network won't be severely congested during peak times. And the traffic impact showed various committee developments would have a severe residual cumulative impact during the PM peak time. So, unfortunately, it was turned down on highway grounds. I have to say, though, whilst that's enormously disappointing, Taylor Wimpey are going to go back in with revised modelling. There is strenuous endorsement by the inspector in terms of the actual scheme, the design, the layout. There's some very interesting landscaping proposals on split levels, the ecology. So everything else was resolved. They'll be going back in, I suspect, to deal with that single issue. I personally found quite interesting the debate about the ancient woodland and the buffer. The local council and the Wildlife Trust were arguing for the 50-metre buffer that we often hear advocated for, but the inspector stuck with the 15 metres, which is the standing guidance for Natural England and the Forestry Commission. But there's quite a debate about that. If you get that far, paragraph 213, it's a big decision from Inspector Woodward. It's a 40-page decision. Well done to Richard Ground and his team for the local authority. They were successful in stopping the proposal. But I would say particularly well done to James Ritchie and his team for overcoming 16 reasons for refusal. You just can't win them all, can you?
Thanks, Chris. Comprehensive, overall, yes. Commiserations to Taylor Wimpey, but they should be quite happy. They've got 16 out of 17 resolved, you say, and hopefully for them, that final one can be, so that allocated side can proceed. Now, next up is our interview. And so, Paul, over to you to introduce Catriona once again to our guests and lead us through the interview, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlie. And hello, Catriona, friend of the show, alumnus of Dunoon Grammar School and University of Strathclyde, head of strategic planning for Surrey County Council in a past life, director of planning for the South East Regional Assembly in a past life, director of planning for the South England Planning Board in a past life, now director of Catriona Riddell Associates, and where you've been for some time, but you're also a strategic planning specialist for the Planning Officer Society, vice chair of the TCPA. You are essentially queen of strategic planning, and so your time has come, Catriona. And you're also, I think, the first guest we've ever had for the third time on the show, so particular welcome to you.
I'm very honoured.
There's a badge we'll send through in due course. But your timing couldn't have been better to come back on the show, given all the excitement that we talked about on the show at the start of the summer with the draft MPPF. And so, for devotees of social media and the planning press, it will be clear you've had a very busy year so far. So can you tell us what you've been doing both before and since the general election? And can you tell us about your role as one of the commissioners of the Barker No. 2 review and co-author of Strategic Planning England on the 16th of August 2024, and Do You Ever Sleep?
Yeah, and it's been very busy, I have to say, but I think one of the best things about doing what I do is I get to do the things I really enjoy, and I don't, previous jobs, I was a director of fairly big teams and senior level, and I spent a lot of time doing all the corporate crap, if I'm honest. Now I get to do all the really good things and I get to pick and choose them, but it has been, it's been a challenging 14 years. I've got many bruises on my forehead from hitting it against the brick wall. And I think it's fair to say when Matty Pennycook took over the shadow ministerial role a couple of years or so ago, there was a little chink of sunshine coming through very dark curtains saying, there is a chance we might get somebody that's interested. The big challenge was keeping him in that post. He did an awful lot of legwork to understand why strategic planning was important. And, I've done my work, but there's that sort of army of people, former strategic planners, people that have still stuck around in the hope that it'll come back, that have been working really hard behind the scenes to try and get politicians to understand the value of strategic planning. It's not a big local plan. As we call it a spatial investment framework. And so a lot of the work's been around just selling the proposition. The next stage will be around what that looks like, and that's the sort of area we're in now. I was very privileged to be able to work with the Labour Party up until the election, sort of on wider planning reforms as well, not just strategic planning, and get a bit of an insight into where they might be taking things. I think probably like everybody, I was a bit shocked at the pace post-election and how quick and how fast things are moving. And I think we've all spent the summer trying to draw breath a little bit around how quick things are going and making sure we don't miss the boat in terms of input. So it's been a busy, particularly last year. The Barker Review is been really interesting. It's been fantastic to work with Kate Parker apart from anything else, and as you will probably have seen, she's now vice chair of the Newtowns task force, so she's sort of stepped back from finishing the Barker Review, but we've got Alex Notte chairing that now, and many of you will know her. She's fantastic. So that is going to be published next month, but we've already sent an interim letter to Matthew Pennycook, which has been received very well. Some of what you were talking about, I think, around the sheer amount of appeals on allocated sites, getting from permissions to delivery, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about through the Barker Review has been around that. It's actually just getting the sort of piece in the ground. So that'll be really exciting. And then the research that University of West of England we're running with on behalf of RTPI, that's the first time we've had any strategic planning proper academic research ever, as far as I know. And that was a fantastic experience. We had so many to get involved in that. And we had, right across the board. And the two biggest things that came out of that was they wanted strategic planning back. They wanted it mandated by government, and they wanted it universally applied across England. And today we are sitting in a very fortunate position in that looks like that's what's going to happen.
Can I ask you a very, very basic question before I ask my next question, which is for the younger viewers, as it were, what is strategic planning?
This has been one of the challenges. We forget that even in the local government, so many planners have never worked in a system pre-2010, so they don't actually know what it is or have any experience of it. I worked in it last century. And as I said, strategic planning for me, the sort of the part, it's a long-term spatial investment framework. It's there to help integrate all the big issues around environment, economy, social issues, and infrastructure. And it's done on a larger than local scale. And there's been different models we've used in the past, structure plans being the one that was the most consistent and was around for decades. And we had regional spatial strategies which didn't survive very long. And I have to say, none of these were abolished, despite some of the rhetoric around them. None of these were abolished because they failed. They were abolished because of, just political views around things like localism. And previously with Labour, they abolished structure plans and things because they had the very firm belief in regional governance. So they sort of, the concept and the real role of strategic planning really got caught up in all these bigger debates and was a casualty of these bigger debates. They never really failed in what they were trying to do. And the big thing with them is they were the ones where you set things like housing numbers. They were the ones where you dealt with strategic greenbelt reviews, dealt with the big strategic infrastructure. The South East Plan, we had 2 water reservoirs in the South East Plan, which never went anywhere when it was abolished. A lot of infrastructure fell between the cracks of local plans and national infrastructure. So a lot of that never happened post 2010. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a flavour for those that don't know what it is, and hopefully very soon they'll get a bit more of what it actually is.
Well, I'm delighted to see behind you, you've still got the LPs on the wall, despite your banging your head against the wall, that they haven't come down yet, all being damaged. But last time you were on, we were all bewailing the end of any sort of regional strategic tier of planning. So is it really on its way back?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the government, Angela Rayner's letters to all the leaders in July and to all the mayoral combined authorities made it absolutely clear, black and white. They are bringing it back. It will be universally applied and it will be mandated. And I think that's the legislation. There's some legislation that needs put in place, and it needs to deal with some of the big issues around things like decision making, for example. We can't have the situation we've got in places like Oxfordshire, the west of England, where you need unanimity, where everyone's got to agree or it falls apart. So they're going to have to make some big decisions around things like that. They're going to have to decide on the geography. So at the moment, mayoral combined authorities is a sort of dead set. That's going to happen. It'll be done on that geography. Outside of that, there's debates around whether it should go back to county geography, whether it should be amalgamations of unitaries. There's different ways to cut up the cake. I think the point that you need a universal approach because the sum of the parts have to add up. And in the research we did on strategic planning, there was a really strong view that we should have a national spatial plan. But in the absence of that, we have to just make sure that the strategic plans add up to a national picture. So we capture everything. And so there's some big debates to be had about who makes the decisions, what geography that's done on, and what the model is. At the moment, the government are saying it would be spatial development strategies because that model exists. It's not really been tried and tested yet, but it's there. And there's a lot more thinking around things like examinations. We can't use a local plan system, tests of soundness to test high-level strategic plans. We know that already, and as part of the conversations on the research, we've had conversations with the planning inspector around that as well. So some big tricky issues to deal with, but the principle is absolutely there in black and white.
But that sounds like we're not going back to the pre-2000 system. It sounds like a new system with differential approaches in potentially counties, unitaries, some counties having separations and mayoral decisions for combined authorities. Is it sort of portmanteau approach? What would you advocate, Catriona?
Well, I think there is absolutely no way they're going back to regional planning sort of done on that vast scale. And if I'm honest, even though I was Director of Planning for the South East region, and I'm sure I've said this before in this programme, most of the heavy lifting was done at that sub-regional scale. It's a much easier scale. It's much easier to sort of take forward national priorities and look at what that means on a local scale. The South East was just vast. We had very few policies that actually operated across that whole region. So I think fixing it, as the government has said, at the sub-regional city region scale is the right move. So I think, and also there's been an argument about reflecting functional geographies. So you've got housing market areas, economic functional areas, and that. But frankly, there is a whole load of different functional relationships that don't operate on the same geography. So I would advocate using some form of administrative boundaries. I was a structure plan person. I will always be a structure plan person. We should never have got rid of structure plans. And so personally, I would probably be pushing for a return to some sort of county stroke unitary geography outside combined authority areas. But I think when you see all the announcements the last couple of days on the new geography for combined authorities, county combined authorities, you can't ignore that. That will probably set the geography for a lot of what we take forward in strategic planning.
Isn't one of the problems, though, in terms of the experience of your career, that you have a lack of stability in the planning system? And what's happened with the incoming government is we've suddenly got yet more instability that's promised. We've got a rocky ride before we get to a system that might be a lot better than the system that we have at the moment. For example, why didn't the government just revert back, do you think, to the pre-December NPPF in the way they just got rid of Eric Pickles' footnote to ban onshore wind? Why didn't they just carry on with the deadlines for local plans, etc.? Is there a problem here about introducing yet more instability and generating more work for, me, Sasha, Chris, Mary, and the rest of the planning bar?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. There's a lot of concern that maybe they went too far too quickly. On a personal level, I think changing the end date for submission of local plans was a huge mistake. I certainly know of a lot of local authorities who are saying, well, why are we bothering when we've got another 18 months on top of 6 months to get a plan in place, and we've got elections next year and elections the year after that. So I think that was a mistake. Again, the numbers was a very political decision. There's a lot of concern about the new formula, a lot of concern about the impact on that, and a little bit of me, it's about cart before horse. To deal with these numbers in a lot of these places, you need strategic planning. So the quicker they get strategic planning in now, the quicker they will be able to get back to a plan-led system, which is what I think we're all really wanting to do. So there's been clearly some Treasury-led decisions, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Numbers. We're trying to shift away from planning by numbers, and at the moment it's still very much planning by numbers. But there is a political. It's really important that we start getting these houses built. It's really important. Chris just talking about that application. It's absolutely bonkers that allocated sites are not going forward as they should be. What is the point of having local plans? So, I get the political objectives around this. I probably wouldn't necessarily have done it in that way that quickly, but it will all come together, I think. I hope.
So I've got two final questions before handing over to colleagues. So the first question really is, what do you understand the roadmap to be in terms of reform? When does the new MPPF come out? Is that the final say? Is there going to be another MPPF? Is there going to be primary legislation? Is there going to be anything from the Levelling Up Act that's not yet been introduced that will be brought forward, like the national development management policies? What do you understand the framework is in terms of these reforms?
Yeah, and it's really important to look at this as the sequencing of all of this and the full reform package. And I've certainly been involved in a lot of discussions around this where there's been a very narrow view around the NPPF changes. But that's only the first part of a much longer reform process. So we've got the NPPF changes and, the promises that will be finalised or published by the end of the year. I would be quite surprised if that happens so quickly, given the amount of responses I think they're going to get. But it will come quickly. I think there is a real effort behind the scenes to get that done quickly. And then we've got the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which I think they were talking initially about laying that before Parliament this autumn. Again, I think they probably won't do that until the NPPF is published. It'll be just too much. And I think internally within civil service and resourcing, they're going to have to manage this because it's a huge amount. And then, again, sequencing, once that gets underway, they're going to have to think about that full review of the NPPF. They've been quite clear that they are keen to introduce national development management policies, so that totally changes the way that the NPPF works. It potentially changes what we do with local plans, and it potentially changes other things like, neighbourhood plans, dare I say. So there's implications for the sort of the whole approach. Just the NDMPs would make big changes, and I think they have said that they're going to take forward some of the other things in the Levelling Up Regeneration Act around the local plan reforms, but they've already said they're not going to take forward the infrastructure levy changes. They're not going to take forward whole local plan design codes, which is a great news for them. That made no sense whatsoever. And there's an issue around the voluntary spatial development strategies, whether that's actually needed now if they're going to shift to a mandatory system, whether that actually is needed anymore. So there's things like that. So, I think probably in terms of sequencing, we'll get the NPPF published, we'll get the new bill on the table, and hopefully that will deal with all the issues around strategic planning. And then you'll have the full review of the NPPF next year sometime. And that's going to be in place in order to deal with the new time frame for submission of local plans to get them start thinking, because there's a lot of local planning authorities that have got up-to-date local plans that need to now start thinking about reviewing their plans, especially in light of the new NPPA.
And the public sector has been grossly underfunded for years. It's the elephant in the room in relation to all of this. And when we get suggestions like we're going to have an extra 300 planners funded, I suggested to you that behind the scenes, that's like handing out olives on the deck of the Titanic to keep the passengers happy. But if we're really going to drive growth and ensure delivery, why is the government looking to ring-fence planning fees and charge for appeals?
Yeah, there's lots around the actual funding side of things, but my view is no matter how much money you've got, you haven't got the planners and the skills to share around, and a lot of this could be solved, dare I say it, with local government reform. In my patch, we've got 11 districts and one county council. The county council deals with all the big issues around social care, education, filling in potholes, dealing with waste, and it's broke. And then we've got 11 districts who mainly just do the local planning functions. That makes no sense whatsoever. And we don't have the urban designers, the ecologists, and all the different skills that go into make good place shaping for every single one of those authorities to access them. So my view is that we either fundamentally change local government, and I think that's not on the cards yet. And maybe, if I'm honest, the devolution process is local government restructuring by stealth. But there is a real opportunity to start thinking about joint teams and having big joint teams. And I think there's another issue there about attracting new people to the profession. They're going into, most of the planners are graduating and going into tiny little teams with no opportunities for progression or shifting around. If we create some really big teams in the way that we used to have, with all the different skills and all the different opportunities, it'd be a much better place to work in local government. So I don't think we're going to solve this by 300 new planners. I don't think we're going to solve it with changing the fees regime, although that will help and both will help. I think we need a fundamental rethink about how we resource planning. And I think we take out all the crap that's been added on to planning, frankly. The amount of things that planning has to deal with that shouldn't be there. I've written my plug for my planning magazine column tomorrow morning is all about this.
I love it. Take out all the crap. That's got to be the headline from this interview. Mary, do you have a question for Catriona?
Yes, thank you very much. I do. I wanted to come back to the RTPI commissioned research, which I know that you were part of. And first of all, that's recommended reading, I would suggest, to all our listeners. And there were 11 key findings. And you've already mentioned, actually, key finding number 9, which is what I wanted to highlight, which is that there's a role for a national spatial strategy, which could add a spatial dimension to current national infrastructure policy statements, as well as the national housing policy requirements, and in so doing sort of support investment priorities. So really my question was, do you detect any appetite, bearing in mind that all the discussions you've had, do you detect any appetite for this? And would you expect the Planning and Infrastructure Bill to facilitate it? And might if it did, might a suite of SDSs in combined authorities, and we've also got new local growth plans, haven't we, coming, might those, as it were, be mandated in a bill and kind of cascade out of the National Planning Spatial Strategy? What do you think?
I think the answer is, I've not heard anybody say it's not going to happen. There's been lots of chat around this for such a long time. RTPI, others have advocated it. And as said in the research, although it wasn't strictly speaking part of strategic planning research, there was a very, very strong view across all sectors that we should have some form of national spatial strategy. The argument, I think, is that this doesn't have to be a very heavy-handed plan. This is a framework, but it does need to join up the dots at the national level. And the industrial strategy that the local growth plans are going to set off is a good example of, they have to reflect that. One of the big challenges I think we've got in all of this is around that joining up the dots. You've got all the different government agencies working for different departments, all with their own separate priorities, all with their separate funding regimes. And we've seen in the planning system the Disruption Environment Agency, Natural England, and others have on that for good reason, but they're coming with very different objectives. If I had a magic wand, and I never in a million years thought I would find myself saying this, I would bring back the regional offices. I think we desperately need something at a more local level to join all the different government functions up and really represent the local areas in the way that the government offices used to do. They all went in. We used to work right next to the Environment Agency, National Highways, or English, whatever it used to be called, and all the various agencies. And we were very joined up. And one of the messages I think we got from somebody was from National Highways in one of the workshops we carried out as part of the research. He said, we can't have conversations. We can't even get to the starting line with 300 plus local planning authorities. It's just not possible. Even if you gave us more resources, we just can't do it. We used to be able to facilitate these conversations through the government offices or the regional strategies or the strategic planning structure plans, but we can't do it now. There's a really big pragmatic issue here. So it's partly thinking about what the national priorities are. New towns need to be thought within a national framework. There's no way that should be done outside of some form of national prioritisation. But it is also about the other end and joining up the dots around delivery and what the government's objectives are across the board on net zero, transport and everything else that goes into making good places.
Thank you very much.
Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. The cleaners are trying to get rid of me, so I might have to go in a minute. They're very, very polite, but they're basically saying, get out. Well done with all the work that you've done with Labour, and well done, for basically being a one-person cause to bring all this back and to be the focus of all this. Look, nobody really sensibly, professionally argues against this strategic planning. I think the answer is city plans and county plans and just get on with it. My concern, though, is, Labour have said 1.5 million homes by the end of the Parliament, 300,000 a year. We're going to have all this debate about strategic planning and what it looks like and all the rest of it. And what we're talking about are strategic development plans which don't allocate sites. So how will we deliver all of those homes if and the employment and everything else if we haven't got allocations, what's going to happen in the next 5 years? Because it's allocations that are the difficult bit, aren't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, local plans don't have to wait till the strategic plans are prepared. That's never happened. There's been a rolling forward of how these work. So they keep going, they get prepared, and then they catch up, and then they keep reflecting what the strategic plan. So it's been a sort of we used to call it rolling forward the planning system. So there's no sort of sequencing here where local plans don't get prepared until the strategic plan's prepared. That doesn't happen. So I think that's one of the myths around this. So we will still get the allocations in place. And I think the getting the plan-led bit is one end of the spectrum. We've got to get that fit for purpose so we don't spend 20 years preparing a local plan and 20 years at examination. So let's get the plan-led system bit right, back on an even keel, and then deal with the other end of the spectrum, which is getting, as we were talking about earlier, planning permission in principle needs to be much, much stronger. We need to use that much more, get permission in principle around allocated sites. We need to take all the rubbish out of conditions, Section 106 and everything like that, so that there's a lot less to deal with in terms of discharging conditions. And we need, there's been lots of chatter, and we've had lots of conversations in the Barker Review about things like national Section 106 models and things like that. The government are proposing a national scheme of delegation to try and take some of the heat out of planning applications and get more through the system. This is a system, and I think we need to remind ourselves daily, this is a system. You can't fix this by fixing one part of it. We need to look at this holistically. It's about the plan-led system all the way through to delivery. And a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of strategic planning is as much about development corporations and call-in processes from, manual call-ins and things like that. So that the other end of the spectrum, again, is making sure that whatever we have in a strategic plan is delivered on the ground. And development corporations, manual development corporations, whatever they're called, whoever's in charge of them, will have a really important role to play in this as well. So we're going to have a suite of different tools coming forward, and a lot of that will play out through the planning and infrastructure bill. But you're right. We've got to get the allocated sites. That's not the role of strategic plans. Nobody I have spoken to wants a Greater Manchester plan. That is a big local plan. It serves its purpose, but nobody I know is looking at that as a model. So we will still need that tier system, the sort of local plans and the sort of strategic plan. I nearly said structure plan there. I have to watch myself.
Great. Thank you very much. And by the way, Jonathan Easton is watching. Good to see you watching, Jonathan. Hope you're feeling well.
Oh, obviously he's not if he's watching us, poor lamb.
Yeah, he'll put some sort of joke in the column now, in the chat now, and everybody will have to laugh.
My wife's also watching and told me off for being grumpy. Charlie, you must have a question for Catriona.
I do, Catriona. I'd like to ask about neighbourhood planning. But there were some who were a little bit surprised to see the consultation draft for the framework leave neighbourhood plans untouched. In paragraph 14, the protection, the effective rebuttal of the tilted balance, including even the extension of the shelf life of paragraph 14 protection to 5 years that was introduced by the December 2023 framework. Do you think, bearing in mind that as the law currently stands, neighbourhood plans don't have to be consistent with the National Planning Policy Framework, they only have to take it into account, do you think leaving neighbourhood plans untouched could undermine the intended rebirth of strategic planning? And might there be something about it in the legislation coming?
I don't know the answer to what government's plans are for neighbourhood plan, but it's been a hot topic over the last few weeks in discussions on the on the planning reform consultation. And I'll probably get on for this, but I've found very little love for neighbourhood plans anywhere. My view is anybody that's tried to do a neighbourhood plan is not going to try and review it because it was so hard the first time round, and there's no resources now to do it. I think it takes away valuable resources within depleted resources in a local government. And I think, it's had its day, and whether it's actively abolished or whether it just withers on the vine. I don't know. I would be very surprised if it's not picked up through the full review of the NPPF and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. I think it's something that the government has to look at, and it would be remiss if it didn't.
I wonder whether it's just changing the basic conditions so that consistency with the framework was mandatory. Simple change might at least keep them in their place, because the danger is all too often neighbourhood planning authorities take the law onto themselves in relation to numbers.
Yeah.
If only we knew somebody who was in the legislature, Charlie. But
No comment.
rather moving forward, Sasha, do you have a question, Catriona?
I do. And my question would be, I mean, you talk about the plan-led system, as Chris has alluded to earlier. The vast majority of appeals I'm now doing are member overturns and allocations which members have ignored. So we can say plan-led system, but unless the elected officials actually give them the weight that they're supposed to, it's all a bit academic. I mean, one of the things, the great sacred cow of planning, of course, is this belief that democratic process demands that members determine applications. Isn't it time, frankly, to get rid of that fiction, really, and take the members and politicians out of a process that depends on planning judgments?
If we get the plan-led system right, then I think you're absolutely right. The further downstream, we need far, far less interventions from the local politicians. I was talking to somebody yesterday, I think, or today, about allocated sites and all the appeals. And, one of the things they said was, well, if we didn't have a constant churn in leadership in local government and local authorities, we wouldn't have this constant change, because even if you've got an up-to-date local plan, if you get a new leadership, a new change in leadership, they don't like what they've already got, so they start refusing applications, even if they're an allocated site. So there's a whole load of issues there, again, wrapped up in how local government works. The fact that they have elections every single year, and so many councils now are very unstable. They're not most of them are rainbow alliances or coalitions or, very small minority leadership. So I think the function, the way local government works within the democratic process has failed miserably over the last decade or so. Localism, I think, the irony is, I think localism totally destroyed local democracy, if I'm really honest. So I think you're right. And I would really hope that we see some strong legislation and national policy around this that makes it very hard. A national scheme of delegation, as somebody's just said, that is, I think, on the cards, but it needs to be backed with a lot more section carrots, I think, for the process, and we need to take a lot of these decisions that have, especially those that have been made through the local plan process, take them out of the planning application process. It's just, and national development management policies will hopefully help with that as well.
Catriona, thank you so much. We could carry on chatting for about the next 3 or 4 hours. You're a fantastic source of wisdom in relation to this. And I think we're in for some entertaining times. And I suspect you may be invited on for a record-breaking fourth time in the future. But for the time being, thank you so much. And back to you, Charlie.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Paul and Catriona, thank you very much. It's always good to see a fellow Bon Jovi fan on the show.
Rangers fan, Sasha. I'm Rangers fan.
Thank you for your huge insight. I absolutely echo what Paul says. This is obviously a story that's going to develop not just between now and whenever the NPPF is published, but thereafter with legislation and the full review. So please do come back on, and we look forward to following your insightful posts on LinkedIn, as always, as the story develops in the meantime.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. I've enjoyed every second.
Fantastic. Have a lovely 2 weeks, dear audience, and we will be back 2 weeks today, and very much look forward to continuing our discussions then. In the meantime, take care and see you soon. Cheers, Catriona.
Bye.
Good night.
Thanks, Catriona.